I watched 26 documentaries spanning 39 years of Titanic history because I have no chill. All right, now I am no historian, I am no engineer, I am no expert in any of this. I am but a nerd who watched a butt ton of documentaries. I straight up am not a qualified authority on the RMS Titanic. Period. I'm not an expert on the history, I'm not an expert on any of the cool going on with Rusticles. But after watching 60 hours of every professionally produced documentary that I could get my hands on, I do feel qualified to talk about Titanic's Eras Tour. I would not be surprised if Swifties had words for me, so I thought it would be really cool to watch all these documentaries with the specific intention of seeing how the legend itself transforms over time. Spoiler alert, I was right! So that this would only be a 60-hour marathon and not like a billion-hour marathon, I did put a cap on what documentaries I was going to consider. For me, it was something that I could at least find the production quality and distribution that would get it played on the roll-in AV cart on a substitute day. So, unfortunately, no to YouTube videos for this list, but yes to like a single themed episode on a Discovery Channel series. This is an art, y'all, not a science. The specter of sensationalism definitely hangs over a lot of it. There is another specter that hangs over these documentaries, especially when we get to the more recent ones. The OceanGate Titan submersible implosion. You know how I said I don't feel qualified to talk about this historic event that happened 100 years ago, has a ton of documentation, and that I've been reading about my entire life? I definitely don't feel qualified to talk about this. But when has that ever stopped me? And for context, we just had the first hearings about the Titan implosion a few months ago as of my filming this. And history has proven that the Titanic's first hearings were a total cluster. So, you know, I'm gonna give that a little bit of space and time, and that is why my timeline for this video stops at June 17th, 2023. The Titan imploded on June 18th. You know what? Speaking of this timeline, let's start with a teeny tiny non-authoritative history lesson. April 10th, 1912, the RMS Titanic set sail on her maiden voyage. April 14th, 1912, at 11:40 p.m., Frederick Fleet, a lookout, spotted an iceberg dead ahead. Shortly after, the iceberg struck the Titanic on her starboard bow. By 2:20 a.m. on April 15th, the Titanic had completely sunken under the waves of the Atlantic, and over 1,500 of her passengers died in the water. September 1st, 1985. Dr. Robert Ballard discovers the wreck site of the Titanic. Side note, that mission was also a smokescreen for the US Navy to survey some sunken US nuclear submarines, but we didn't know that yet. 2012, the 100th year anniversary of the sinking and the home for many, many documentaries. This is that same timeline with all of the documentaries that I watched on it. Can you tell that graphic design is my passion? That's a little bit overwhelming, but luckily, the story started to unfold into a natural collection of eras, depending on where we were in this timeline. I don't recommend that anybody binge watch 40 years of documentaries on the same single subject, but some of these I do very greatly recommend. And then there are also some that I only recommend as iron ore deposits at the bottom of the sea. Some of you might want to come on this journey with me. I mean, one of my favorite genres of YouTube video is multi-hour deep dives into a super niche subject. But for those of you who are not interested in the full Eras Tour and just came here for the highlight reel, I got you. Just go to this timestamp and I'll get you with the recommendations. I'm reading for this part because I want to make sure I get it right. And before we get started, for the record, I don't speak a lick of French, so I'm so sorry about what I'm going to do to these pronunciations. Joseph Philippe Lemercier-Laroche was born in 1886. He traveled to France to study engineering as a teenager, and that's where he married and started a family. When he had an offer for a professorship in mathematics, Joseph took it. He had a pregnant wife and 2 daughters. And the rampant racism made it hard for him to find decent work with decent employers. So together, they booked passage back to Haiti by way of New York on the maiden voyage of the RMS Titanic. On the night of April 14th, 1912, Juliette, Simone, and Louise LaRoche made it onto Lifeboat 8, presumably. Juliette noted that there was a countess on the boat with them. Joseph promised his wife that they would see each other soon. Joseph's body was never recovered. and his family had to move forward in the pain and horror of losing him that night. Joseph LaRoche is known as Titanic's only black passenger, and sadly, his story was never one of the ones shared in these documentaries. But he deserves to be remembered and honored, just like every other life lost on the Titanic. The memory, the enigma. All right, so we start out this marathon strong with Search for the Titanic on 2 points. 1, we've got Orson Welles kicking off this documentary journey, hell yeah. 2, we see the expedition that almost found the Titanic. And this one is a great place to start. We start with a beautiful and somber recap of the actual events before we set up the mystery of what we're actually doing here today, which is the question of, where the hell is the ship? And this is our first introduction to Dr. Robert Ballard, who we will be seeing a lot through many of these documentaries. And he and his team are just so close to the site. They're picking up so many promising signals. In fact, they're starting to zero in on the fact that it's not just the site, but it might be the sites, plural. And it's just heartbreaking watching the weather turn against them and watching the team make that horrible choice to have to turn back and just letting this answer slip right back through their fingers into the abyss. This is peak human drama, and I love it. Titanic, A Question of Murder, hands down, has the most questionable cover and title of this entire lineup. And because of that, I went in expecting so very little of this documentary. But man, sometimes I just really love to be wrong. This is one of the most human-centric documentaries of the entire bunch, and I adore it. Like, by this point in history, the sands of time were running. The survivors that we had, they were growing old. We were starting to lose their stories to history. So this documentary really focuses on doing 2 things. 1, capturing the stories of the survivors from their own mouths while they're still here to tell it. And 2, which is where we get our title, an unflinching investigation into the capitalist corner cutting that led to this whole cascading chain of failures and 1,500 deaths. And this is a single documentary, so maybe they don't make the best case for singular murder. Maybe this was that sensationalism to get someone to look at this documentary. But what they do is shine a really impressive light on what sounds like some pretty strong negligent homicide cases. It's not a deep dive into the mechanical history so much. It's not a marvel of the ship. It's not a marvel of the science to make her, or the science to find her, or the science to watch her decay. But it's about incredible human stories and understandings of human decisions that both got us there and moved us forward. And it's got a really sharp intention, a great direction, and one of the best line deliveries of all time.
The Titanic responded, "Shut up, I'm busy."
That will forever live in my heart and my content. And if you noticed it before, now you know what it's from. Sorry for the jump scare. The first recording of this got corrupted. On April 10th, 1963, the USS Thresher became the first nuclear submarine to be lost at sea, along with all the men on board. The theory is that a piping failure in the engine room caused a short circuit in the ship's electrical system, which then caused the reactor to shut down, and the ship completely lost power. Matters were just made worse by a failure in the ship's ballast tanks, which prevented the ship from deballasting and rising. So instead, it just sank. On May 27th, 1968, the USS Scorpion was lost in what was presumably an explosion. The question remains to this day as to what caused that explosion, whether there was an issue with the torpedo, if there was a malfunction of the trash disposal unit, or even if it was a Soviet attack. What they did know is there were nuclear weapons on board and exactly where it sank. The US government wanted to do a few things with these sunken subs, like doing a head count on those nuclear arms and studying the impact of the nuclear weapons on the surrounding underwater environment. But we're in the 80s at this point. The US government can't risk Soviets getting wind of this and finding those locations. They need a cover story. Enter Dr. Robert Ballard in 1982. He approaches the Navy about funding an expedition to search for the Titanic's wreck with his new deep-sea underwater craft called Argo. The Navy isn't particularly interested in funding a search for the Titanic on its own, but they do know that that estimated wreck site is interestingly close to the remains of the Thresher and the remains of the Scorpion. They also knew that Argo was one of their best chances at finding and surveying those subs. So the US Navy agreed to fund Ballard's expedition so that he could find the Titanic, on the condition that he covertly surveyed their ships first. And damned if that man didn't do it all.
The wonder below.
So we are fresh off the discovery of the actual Titanic, the chunk of metal under the sea, and there is so much reverence and also a certain amount of gawking. But to be fair, this is a very easy event to gawk at. The nightmare and the dream is like the source material for every other documentary in this section. It is the definitive, super informative, but also kind of super dry documentation of Dr. Robert Ballard's expedition where he found the Titanic. Still missing the details about the nuclear subs, but that's okay. We're more interested in the Titanic here. This documentary is scientific, it is reverent, and it is such a time capsule as to what the discovery itself was. If you want to time travel for a little bit, I recommend this one. Return to the Titanic was one of those billion-hour live TV events where they keep dangling footage in front of you of the newly discovered Titanic not seen by anybody ever. And they edge you with some of the least interesting interviews I have ever seen about a sea disaster. However, this was my first interaction with the Titanic conspiracy theories. See, they bring on a guy taking care to put all 5 hyphenates of what an entrepreneur he is in his name on the introduction. And he says that his dad during World War II sailed with this guy out of France who said that he had been a stoker on the Titanic. And this guy would allegedly say over cards that there was no iceberg, that in fact the ship had been blown open by an explosion of a tank because of an uncontrolled coal fire. And now this guy who heard about it like third hand is speculating on live TV that maybe it was an insurance cover-up. But don't worry. They bring on some actual experts, right? They bring on this coal engineer who explains that if there was such a coal fire acting in that way, it still wouldn't have done that sort of damage. So put that one to bed. Until this coal engineer decides that it's his turn to speculate now. And so then he starts thinking about, well, but I mean, I guess if there was a coal fire, then maybe the captain knew about that, but he was trying to keep it a secret. So he had to keep the ship going fast and he had to keep the ship going cold. So of course he had to be speeding through that ice field, because if he didn't, then the ship would blow up. It was a rock and a hard place between an explosion and an iceberg. All right, but here's the thing. One of my pet peeves that I have discovered through this whole watch through is the eternal question of, why were they going so fast? The reaction like it's a complete mystery. We've never known why this team of experienced sailors decided to have the fastest ship ever go as fast as and that just really grinds my gears, because we've known since forever exactly why they were going that fast. Conventional wisdom at the time was that when you were in an ice field, you maintained a speed that was for peak maneuverability. The thing is, the Titanic and her sister ships were not like any of the ships that conventional wisdom had been educated upon. Titanic's big old luxurious booty was a lot faster with a lot more inertia. And guess what? Titanic and other similar disasters are part of how we now know that that wisdom no longer holds. Maybe like a retired navigator, or a captain, or an expert on ships and navigation. Hell, even a hardcore nerd who had read a few books on naval history. They might have been able to fill the audience in on that little question mark. But we don't talk to any of those people. We talk to the guy with third-hand hearsay and the world's largest resume, and a guy with a very specific niche just riffing, because they're not trying to educate on Return to Titanic. They are trying to entertain. They are trying to keep people tuned in for all 4 hours of this unending nightmare that even Telly Savalas very valiantly holds his microphone and delivers his lines that he is reading from those cue cards so that he can go home and get his paycheck. I don't blame him. Everything I just complained about, Titanica is the exact opposite of that. This 1992 IMAX documentary is gorgeous. This is the first one that I've seen that feels so positively cinematic. And it definitely educates you on the history of the sinking, which is good, right? This is a good introduction for someone who's got a very limited understanding of the Titanic. But the focus is very much on showing off the newfound grandeur and beauty of this behemoth under the waves. Don't get me wrong, you still get your customary interview with Ava Hart, bless her, but the focus is very much on the wonder that was and is again of Titanic. I highly, highly recommend Titanica, maybe to the point that it ruined me for the other ones after it, because the next two, they're fine. Titanic, Death of a Dream uses a lot of the same footage and information of Titanica. It owes a lot to it. It's got a little bit more of a focus on the original construction, but honestly it doesn't bring much new to the table compared to like Titanica, and it's way harder to find. Explorers of the Titanic is mostly a pastiche of all the documentaries and interviews that we've already watched. And if you hadn't been marathoning them, this would be a great documentary. But if you've already been marathoning these for a bit and seen all this footage, it kind of cheapens the watch a little bit, or at least it did for me. There is one bone that I have to pick with it, which is that I do feel like they spend a lot of time blaming everything on the helmsman, like speculating that if he had moved faster and if he had just gotten the captain involved sooner, then the captain surely would have saved the day and fixed everything if the helmsman hasn't hesitated for like 2 seconds. And I just don't think that's an accurate or fair assumption. I think it's them trying to come up with an interesting take and identify characters because it's 1996 and a movie is gonna come out soon. Titanic, The Investigation Begins had me laughing my ass off, and I definitely don't think they meant for that. So a point of discussion in a lot of these is about the Titanic as a curiosity and the Titanic as a gravesite. There's a lot of talk about how moral it may or may not be to retrieve artifacts and to use salvage laws to assign a legal steward of the site. Should we be taking as much as possible to learn, or should we leave everybody and everything resting in peace? Should we even be taking pictures? All of this is really interesting stuff. Stuff that I am still chewing on and have yet to land on like my own definitive answer about, right? If I'm ever gonna land on a definitive answer about it. And like, I'm pretty familiar with basic physics. I understand the weight of different materials and how to create buoyancy and stuff like that. But I know that I am not a fan of using balloons full of tons and tons of diesel fuel miles under the Atlantic Ocean so that we can scavenge a piece of hull. And super thankfully, there are no oil spills in this, but there is an amazing amount of schadenfreude. It's all about the retrieval of this 20-foot piece of hull that had already come loose. They weren't yanking it off or anything, and then bringing it home so that the Titanic can complete her maiden voyage. I get it, but I don't, you know? All of that is only for them to get it feet from the surface and drop it. And I mean, I get it, it is horrible and dismaying and so disappointing for everyone on that boat in so many ways. But I wish they had included more footage. Like, when do we see like this happen? It's like the mirror image of Search for the Titanic with Orson Welles. And don't worry, they did go back like a year later to pick it up. They didn't just leave a chunk of the Titanic 10 miles away from the rest site or anything. And when it made it to land, we did learn a bunch of interesting stuff about the composition of the steel. But watching that rope snap was really funny to me. Sorry, not sorry. Meet Louis Abernathy, real-life deep-sea explorer and great friends with other real-life deep-sea explorers, one of whom just happened to be making a movie. So this friend asked Louis if he wants to be in it. And he's on board. He takes a couple of weeks of acting classes and gets ready to essentially play himself as Louis Bodine in Titanic. It's a niche little indie film. It's okay if you haven't heard of it. The legend. Money, 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 money! So Titanic, end of an era. Narratively, tonally would have been perfect for the last video of the last era. But we're going based on timeline. And so in that case, it lands here. End of an Era is mostly focused on where the Titanic disaster landed in the Edwardian era. How this disaster, in combination with World War I, were the symptoms and the swan songs of the Gilded Era. They didn't cause the end of the era, but they were symptoms of its death. And I thought it was interesting because it was the first time I ever thought to draw a parallel between Titanic and Charles Manson and Nixon and what they meant for the hippie counterculture, you know? That's not in any of the docs, that's just me speculating. The coolest part about End of an Era for me, though, is its focus on using resources from that particular era and really understanding it within its native context. It's a really great final chapter to hold the stories of all the people who built, lived, and died on Titanic. Titanic 90 years below kicks open the new millennium with a f***ing vengeance. First off, the soundtrack sounds like something Joe LaDuca would write, which would have been perfect for baby me daydreaming about Xena and the Spice Girls somehow saving the Titanic. Don't judge child me. In my humble opinion, this doc is the best one in summarizing everything we know at this point in time, including a bunch of details that happened in the past that we didn't get to talk about, like Dr. Robert Ballard's secret mission for the Navy. And honestly, in the heat and the passion of everything that they're covering, then it's funny that the secret mission to survey nuclear submarines feels like mundane compared to everything else. We even have a full circle moment with the movie and the deep sea expeditions that came from and were inspired by that. And this is the first time that we're really seeing in a lovely aesthetic bow how Ballard's discovery and the 97 movie were both arguably as integral to the legend now as the Titanic itself. This one also had a fantastic modern comparison for the purpose of like contextualizing it, which was to compare in 1912 the sinking of the Titanic to the explosion of the Challenger. That resonated, that made it click for me. Ghost of the Abyss is hands down the film that I would most want to see in IMAX from this lineup. It is a Disney production that is absolutely very clearly intended to pair with the 97 movie. This is a James Cameron film, and it follows James Cameron, Bill Paxton, and Louis Abernathy on an expedition to the Titanic with some of the most advanced cameras on the planet. Beautifully narrated by Bill Paxton, which gives the entire thing kind of an uncanny vibe, but I like it. On a really fascinating note about where we are in history though, like remember that Challenger comparison from the last documentary? Like James Cameron and crew have this really happy and successful expedition, and then they come up to the water to learn some horrible news. This is when the audience learns that they were down there filming on September 11th, 2001. This is where we are in history, yeah? What a timely bummer of an ending. But this is absolutely one of my hardest recommendations from this entire list. You're gonna have a hell of a time finding it free, but it is worth the money to at least rent it. Tony Robinson's Titanic adventure sure took me on an adventure. Having seen only this one episode of this TV show and knowing Tony Robinson from nothing else, what I gather is Tony Robinson is a surprisingly self-aware TV host who is going with James Cameron on his final dive. See, James Cameron has been on 35 dives with over 300 hours. Those are some pretty serious credentials. This guy spent more time on the Titanic than the people who were actually like on the Titanic. And I'm only saying that not because I'm like a James Cameron stan or anything, but just because I do feel like I encounter people who are like, he directed a movie, that doesn't make him an expert. And like, yeah, no, directing a movie does not make you an expert necessarily, but the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours that he's done at the site, studying, working with other experts and scientists, that is what makes him an expert, especially when it comes to matters of like deep sea diving, filming, and exploration. And we're gonna see a lot of him moving forward, to the point that I kind of feel like I'm parasocial besties now with him and Ava Hart. And oh my god, that feeling got me and was only made worse because apparently I have seen this episode of this one random TV show before. It is etched on my heart and seared into my memory. It was amazing sitting there on my living room floor and watching James Cameron and crew discover in one of the fanciest rooms of the most famous ship on the entire planet, 100 years later, underwater, under a crash, there was still a clock attached to the mantelpiece with its hands forever frozen at the time that it was reclaimed by the sea. Holy that's cool! The Strauss cabin clock is so cool! Like, what an anomaly! How do we find that? That's so cool that we saw that, because what are the chances? You know, like, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, it still makes a sound. But 100 years later, we got to come and hear the sound of this falling tree. That's cool. There's also some really great discussion that I really recommend watching this doc for alone, pointing out how many of the people that we remember from the Titanic, especially the crew, are remembered and on their memorials talk about how they honorably and valiantly died at their posts. And I don't want to minimize that in any way, shape, or form, but I do think there's an interesting discussion to be had about if that's how we should remember them. If we should remember them for literally working until the moment that they died, instead of thinking about what the circumstances that took them there were. Should they have died? Should they have even been at their posts? There's so many questions, again, that like I'm not the person to talk about them, but I do think they are discussions to be had and things to think on. So if nothing else, I recommend watching this documentary for that. But also go in prepared, because shortly after that discussion, we get introduced to a different type of dread, implosion. Tony spends a lot of his time, because of his own fear of being imploded to death, discussing the very real possibility that this is. But he also spends a lot of time talking about the safety measures that they are taking on this particular expedition. We even see that when a camera isn't working exactly quite right, they'll delay the entire launch. Imagine what they care about when it comes to human life and risk. And this section made me even more angry about how completely unnecessary the OceanGate Titan implosion was. If you watch any piece of OceanGate promotional material from before the disaster, you're gonna see a lot of comments that age like milk regarding disregard for safety and constant push to understand that what they are doing is new and revolutionary and no one has done this before, and they are beyond certification because certification is not up to speed with what they are doing, which is going in a submersible to the Titanic. And those health and safety codes are not up to date for the crazy groundbreaking work that they are doing by taking this submersible miles down, which is bull. At this point in Tony Robinson's year of 2005, manned submersibles have been going down to the Titanic for 20 years, and verified safe submersibles built to existing code and informing that code so it can evolve. And for the idea of that being new, one guy, not even counting everyone else on the planet who wants to go see the world's most popular ship, one guy racked up 35 dives in that timeline. And yes, to be fair, James Cameron is known to have an uncertified deep sea submersible that he designed, built, and pilots. But you know what that submersible is for? Reaching the Challenger Deep, the deepest known point on Earth. And you know how many seats that experimental submersible has? 1. So if it fails on him, it fails on him. And even at that, all right, the same psycho who built his own coffin to go down to the Challenger Deep, when he goes to see the Titanic, which is a regular thing that he does, he goes to see it in an expertly designed machine full of plugs and switches and fanciness. Stockton Rush used a Logitech controller to take a bunch of people down in his science project with him. Maybe. I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. Don't listen to me. All I know is that I think that the Titan was a completely avoidable tragedy, but it's also arguable that the Titanic was too, so I don't know. Hey, what's up? You want to talk about window etchings? Because apparently, despite the immense amount of records into Titanic's construction and everything that should have been on it, we weirdly enough don't have any patterns copied anywhere for the etchings used in the decorative windows of the first class lounge. We know what dishes they were eating off of, what chairs they were sitting on, but we don't actually know what they were looking at. And it's unlikely that we ever will, because I mean, what are the chances that a single decorative pane of glass was going to survive a ship tearing apart, sinking miles, and then decaying on the ocean floor for a century? The one that did! Bam! Look at that! That is an Irish nautical Celtic motif. The Titanic was beautiful, goddamn. Alright, so now we also have a little mini subsection of documentaries. All of the following documentaries are not so much about the Titanic, so much as they understand that you already probably know a decent amount about the Titanic. So let's take that starting point to expand our horizons a little bit, right? Curse of the Titanic Sisters fills you up on all the crazy shenanigans that the Britannic got up to. Titanic Ballard's Secret Mission is exactly that. It's about how the Titanic was a smokescreen for the actual secret mission of surveying the USS Thresher and the USS Scorpion. Did you know that at the time of the Titanic's construction, there was a kind of ocean liner space race happening, and that was part of what was driving everybody to go for such luxury and such speed and size? That's what Last Days of the Liners is about. 100 years is actually not that long, but also very long. There are only 4 documentaries in this section, and 2 of them are actually really, really good. And maybe it's just me. If this was a running marathon, this would absolutely be when I hit the wall. It felt like there was so much, and yet so little. Everything was there, but nothing was new. And maybe again, I'm judging this era so hard because I decided to do this all in a marathon. But at the same time, there are so many documentaries all over this lineup that are much better uses of your time than some of these. The 100-year era feels like it should be this big explosion of, look at all the cool things we've learned over a century of digging into this thing. And I get that, and yes, that came up. But also a lot of what came up was people trying desperately to find something new to say while working with the same library of information. Titanic, 100 Years in 3D is gorgeous, informative, and dry as hell. I really enjoyed it because I'm the sort of sick who gets really excited to learn about design efficiencies in the engines and boilers that were revolutionary for the time and why. They also highlight some really cool pieces of historical context, like even third class for its time was still considered an absolute luxury. And White Star Line specifically had a reputation of being really good to immigrants in a way that other liners weren't. Too bad they weren't as thoughtful to their employees. A lot of the documentaries that we've already watched and that we're going to watch take all of the hindsight and information that we have and use that to kind of vilify the decisions made by the crew of the Titanic at the time. But what I really like about this documentary is that it is so good at being aware of our perspective while also informing us on the perspective of the people who were there at that moment in time. If you're down to pay attention and you're really into technology from 100 years ago, then this documentary is a great recommendation. If you want every single empirical detail available tied up for you and also referenced back to where that may or may not have been seen in the 97 movie, then Titanic: The Final Word with James Cameron is for you. You want to know about how you can use debris spread to locate the sinking location on the surface of the ocean? We got you. Want some really cool underwater shots of robots? We got you. And I do want to set expectations here. This is by no means as fun, say, as Ghosts of the Abyss. This is not a documentary by James Cameron, the Hollywood director. This is a documentary by James Cameron, the deep sea explorer, obsessed with recreating and detailing every single possible aspect of the Titanic. And now I'm taking all of these documentaries on face value. Full transparency, I have not been out here fact-checking all of them as a matter of practice. When I go and do some research to fact-check them, it's because they really pissed me off. Like the next one. Have you ever had one of those moments where you're really excited to learn a new skill or something, and so like you find a workshop at your local library that's being put together by a group of local experts and you're like, yes, this will be great. I can socialize, I can learn new stuff, I can indulge my special interest. And because you know just enough to be dangerous, when you get there, your teacher says something that makes you instantly go, oh no, I can't trust you. Starting it with things like over 20 expeditions since first found. And like, yes, you are technically correct, but I can also see you're missing a lot already. And I don't know if they left off a qualifier or something, because the last several documentaries have been super clear about the fact that like, there's way more than 20. One guy had 35 and he's not even the only one going down there. We talked about this. According to Titanic at 100, mystery solved. There are 3 questions about the Titanic that linger to this day, and only this documentary will be able to solve them. Why were they speeding through the ice field? Why weren't there enough lifeboats? Was there a defect in the materials? And yes, those are very valid questions to ask, but what you might find when you ask them normally is that we have answers to these. Some as far back as from 1913. And to be fair, there is no judgment to be had if you don't already know these answers. That's fine. I think it's totally valid to have seen a movie, been like, oh, and moved on with your life. That's cool. But what I am saying is that if you're going to go through all the trouble of making a documentary about these things, maybe you should know that there are already very easily accessible answers to these questions. We already discussed they weren't speeding through the ice field by their estimation. They were prioritizing maneuverability. There were actually more lifeboats on the Titanic than legally required, despite not being enough for every soul on ship. At the time, lifeboats were not intended to be used to house every soul aboard while the ship itself sank. Instead, it was intended that they would shuttle passengers back and forth between a slowly sinking ship and a ship that had arrived to rescue them. Titanic was one of the events that made us reconsider that thinking. Was there a defect in the materials? Yes. Despite being made of over 50,000 tons of steel, Titanic was constructed using a new alloy of steel that was cheaper to produce and ended up making the metal much more brittle. I learned that one at the Titanic Museum in Branson, along with the story of Joseph LaRoche. But no, Titanic at 100, mystery solved, would much rather hit you in the face with a bunch of manic editing over creepy true crime music. This is the purest example of sensationalism over education, and I don't like it. Titanic, the missing link, has nothing in common with the previous doc. To be honest, it is kind of barely about Titanic. It's actually a lot more about Ireland and about the economic and cultural impact of this behemoth of history and technology. It's a family reunion of the generations that came after the designers and builders. It would be the best double feature with Titanic: A Question of Murder. Halomonas titanicae is an iron-eating bacteria that was identified in 2010 on that same expedition that the 2012 documentaries were milking for all they're worth. And it's so beautiful because in even one of the darkest, deepest, coldest parts of the ocean, this specialized life form has found itself a 52,310 ton all-you-can-eat buffet, and it's got at least 27 other types of bacteria to be its neighbors. Halomonas titanicae consumes the iron from the steel and recycles it into a porous structure called a rusticle, like an icicle. But rusticles are not forever. Rusticles are incredibly delicate, porous items that will eventually disintegrate into a fine powder that joins the sands of the ocean. Rusticles. Drain the Titanic is a 2015 episode of a series called Drain the Oceans. The entire concept is about using scans and digital recreations of deep ocean mysteries so that we can study and investigate them under the light of day. It's a really neat concept, and for the most part, I found it to be cool and informative. But guess what? I've got a problem with it. See, an interesting part, to me at least, of the Titanic's long legend in history is just how long it went, with the biggest question of it being, did it tear apart under its own weight at the surface? Now, while there were people on the lifeboats who did not see it on this dark night in the cold with bizarre sights and sounds and hundreds of people dying around them, there were witnesses who very clearly, from their vantage point on the lifeboats, saw the ship break apart under its own weight. The testimony of those witnesses, though, was not actually submitted into the court during the official hearings because women couldn't speak in the British court in 1912. The testimony that we did get regarding the breakup was from surviving crewmen on the Titanic. And their testimony was really about what seemed like maybe some sort of explosion while they were fighting for their lives on an actively sinking ship. And their accounts led to the official belief that the Titanic did not break apart and sank as a single object. This was proven wrong in 1985 when the ship was found in two pieces miles apart from each other. And now, with all of the hindsight of history, we can look back on the interviews and the testimonials of those survivors, and we can corroborate all of that pretty closely. They saw the Titanic tear apart under its own weight at the surface of the ocean. You might have noticed some very specific verbiage there. You might be more familiar with the common phrasing of saying that the Titanic broke in two on the surface. And that's the commonly recited and understood way of saying it, as opposed to the pedantic, the Titanic tore apart under its own weight while still at the surface and was later found in 2 pieces miles apart. Drain the Titanic spends a lot of time proclaiming, exclaiming, and declaring that they have proven that the Titanic did not break apart in 2 pieces at the surface. And here is even the official inquiry from when it happened that doesn't say anything about the ship breaking in 2, just that there were explosions. The actual, less sensational version is really a clarification of what we've always heard. The answer is that the Titanic did indeed tear apart, which caused explosions under its own weight while at the surface. However, it was not a clean split. Part of the hull was still attached, which did mean that the bow was pulling down the stern, and that is also what created some of the angles, like the finger of God, as it's described. But there is also forensic proof of another break that happened further below the surface. We can assume and use all sorts of models and data to recreate that this was when the clean break happened, splitting the Titanic fully in 2 before the pieces went to rest miles apart. Literally, the next documentary is going to spend like more than half of its runtime explaining exactly the forensics of that. But sure, let's go ahead and let's get some eyes on your TV show. Let's completely invalidate all of those survivor stories again and use the same information that was used to gaslight them for the better part of a century so that you can say something shocking to get eyes on your documentary. And maybe it's not that big of a deal, but you know what? Either way, shame on you, drain the Titanic. Titanic 20 years later with James Cameron proves that the final word with James Cameron was not in fact our final word with James Cameron. First, the 20 years later is not referring to anything about the actual ship or any of the discoveries. That 20 years later is pointing us directly to the movie in 1997. Because as we said, this really is part of the greater Titanic legend now. First, they come back and use a bunch of science and models like we talked about to explain the forensics of the ship's breakup. They also use that to take accountability and point out that probably unlike in the movie, the real stern did not splash back after the break, but instead was just pulled directly down to get to that finger of God position. Then we spend the rest of the documentary getting human stories, which, you know, I love. And this was one of those relationships that I'm surprised I didn't think about more. The heart of all of these interviews is a reminder that the Titanic is not ancient history. This was recent, and the descendants and family of loved ones are still around to tell their stories and to interact with media about it, like the movie. So James Cameron is talking to descendants of survivors and specifically getting family stories, but also clarification on what the movie left out or just plain got wrong. And what I actually really like here is that there's a lot of accountability shown, and I think that's cool. For instance, we have Molly Brown's granddaughter making a spectacular case for why I need to go buy a bunch of biographies of this woman and find out more about her. And she points out some of the coolest stuff about Molly's story that happened right where her story ended in the film. Like when she commandeered the lifeboat that she was on, using the same insult that the crewmen spat at her to take over and go back and try and rescue people. They talk about just how shocking it was to see a field of dead faces in the ice and thinking about the sort of impact that that could have had on someone who had seen that sight in real life. They talk about survivors who couldn't go to ball games because the sounds of hundreds of people screaming together took them back to that night with all those people screaming in the water. James Cameron very clearly, pointedly calls himself out on the fact there's a story from the Titanic of an unidentified crewman who may have shot a passenger before shooting himself. We don't have any identity associated with that crewman. Rupert Murdoch was a real person with a memory and a legacy and a recent family who held his memory close. So James Cameron talks about, though, how the story would hit harder if it was on a named character. So he made the artistic choice at the time to have named character Rupert Murdoch be the one to enact out that rumor, not thinking about the actual family there. And they had some feelings about this story being apocryphally applied to their family member. And James Cameron then points out that he's like, yeah, you know what? I could have made that anybody. I could have made that any unnamed crew member. It didn't need to be someone actually attached to people. I'm like, yes, I love it. We still have the artistic integrity, but also the artistic awareness. That's all I'm looking for, people. But anyways, back to the Titanic. Curious Minds Titanic is actually kind of a hard find, and it's also kind of dry discussion about a lot of the same forensics and information that these other documentaries are talking about. It's good, but like nothing stands out to me. So by 2020, some amount of time has passed since the last expedition to the Titanic. And this documentary keeps saying it's been 15 years since an expedition, but like every documentary in 2012 was milking the same 2010 documentary, so I'm not sure if there's just like a qualifier or weird editing thing that happened there. I don't know. But we also know how I feel about that sort of trivia, so moving on. What they find is what they feared that they would find, which is that the Titanic is decaying at a rate much faster than expected. From the bacteria and rusticles consuming it slowly to the incredible force of the deep ocean currents, it's all part of the natural cycle to be curious, to consume, and to recreate as something new. It's nature, it's life. And from this site of enormous tragedy, death, and mystery, a new life and ecosystem continues. And that's kind of nice. I actually really like that thought. Like, no matter how big, how beautiful, how big for our britches humanity gets, we will always be humbled by nature, whether that's through icebergs or rusticles. All right, my loves, we have done it. We have sifted through decades of Titanic lore. And if you made it this far, before we start the award ceremony, I have a special award just for you. Yes, you. Yeah, you. I mean you watching me right now. Because you're the MVP for sitting through all of this. Thank you. Timestamp people, welcome back. It's good to see ya. Now, instead of just some straight recommendations, I decided we could make a little award ceremony out of these double, triple, quadruple features. Now, circling back to the Swifties, category is the teeny tiny Titanic era tour. Now, this category is a list of the best documentary to encapsulate the essence of each era. From The Memory and the Enigma, we have Titanic, A Question of Murder. From The Wonder Below, we have Titanic. The legend, trademark money, is Ghosts of the Abyss. They've got the Disney budget, they had to. For 100 years is not very long, but also very long. Our winner is The Final Word with James Cameron. I swear to God, I'm not a fangirl. I'm not even sure how I feel about his personality, but he makes good films about the Titanic. And from the Rusticles era, yeah, it's no contest. It's 20 years later with James Cameron. Let's pretend to be surprised. New category. Category is Binge a Few on a Sick Day. Tony Robinson's Titanic Adventure, 90 Years Below, and Titanic 100 Years in 3D. Category is You Were Surprised to Find Out That the Titanic Was Not Just a Movie. And this one's gotta go to Ghosts of the Abyss. That is entirely the intended audience for this non-fiction companion to the movie. Category is Super Tech Nerd Mecha Celebration. And this one's a four-parter. We've got The Nightmare and the Dream, The Final Word with James Cameron, Titanic, Ballard's Secret Mission, and Titanic 100 Years in 3D. Category is, I'm really more of a people person. Titanic, A Question of Murder, Titanic, The Missing Link, and Titanic 20 Years Later with James Cameron. Eat all these personal stories up. Category is Iron Dust Pile at the Bottom of the Ocean. These are the documentaries that could be lost to history, and I won't be sad about it. Return to Titanic with Telly Savalas, Titanic Mystery Solved, Train the Titanic. Finally, we have If I Could Only Recommend One. And guess what? I couldn't pick just one. So for second runner-up, we have Titanic 20 Years Later with James Cameron. Our first runner-up, our second place, isn't she beautiful? It's Ghosts of the Abyss, everybody. And now, for the moment you've all been waiting for my number one recommendation of this Titanic marathon. Titanica. I know. I've got all these options and I choose this one, and I didn't even go back and mention it 4 times with a clip.
The Titanic responded, "Shut up, I'm busy."
But when I think about the perfect Titanic documentary that I want to turn on and get lost in, it is this 1992 IMAX beauty. It's just as fascinated with the people and the history as it is with the physical object herself. It's nostalgic for me in a way. And on top of all of that, it's from an era when we really were discovering new things about the Titanic all the time. And there was always something to explore, to discover, and they just didn't need to sensationalize the same way to keep it fresh. I really feel like I accomplished something here today. And not for like the world or anything, just for me. Because I really kind of feel like I've exorcised a demon or something. Like the hours and hours and hours of my life, especially recently, dedicated to watching all of these documentaries. Feels really good to finally be done with that. I say that, but I've got like 3 giant projects ahead of me that I'm super excited about. So apparently I don't learn my lesson. Also, I need to give a massive shout out to another YouTube channel here, Titanic Films by Mark. I would not have been able to get this project done without that channel. So thank you, Mark, for all of the archival work that you have done there. If you're really interested in seeing any of these, go check out his channel, give him a like. Now I do have 2 asks of you guys today here, all right? So first, what niche topic did you just stumble into as a child and now it is forever imprinted on your personality? And 2, stay kind to yourself and take care of yourself out there, okay? Bye.
The Titanic responded, "Shut up, I'm busy."